Don't touch it! The command froze my hand inches from the jagged shard of the vase I'd just dropped. I kept my eyes on the floor, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I waited for the yelling. I waited for the punishment that always followed a mistake in this house. "I'm sorry, Alpha," I whispered, reaching for the glass anyway, desperate to hide the evidence of my clumsiness. "I'll clean it up. I'll pay for it, I promise." I said, "Don't touch it." Boots, heavy, expensive, and terrifyingly silent, stepped into my vision. Magnus didn't walk around the mess. He walked right through it, crushing the porcelain to dust under his heel. He stopped in front of me. I flinched, bracing for the blow, but it never came. Instead, two large warm hands wrapped gently around my waist. Before I could gasp, he lifted me effortlessly into the air, setting me down on the clean marble counter, far away from the sharp edges. He gripped my chin, forcing me to look up. His eyes weren't angry. They were devastatingly sad. "Stop shaking, Mira," he murmured, his thumb brushing the tear tracking down my cheek. "In my pack, we do not punish accidents. And we certainly do not let queens clean up their own messes." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a dangerous, possessive whisper that made my toes curl. "The only thing I care about breaking in this room is you. Does that make your chest ache? That is the difference between a boy who wants to control you and a king who wants to protect you." Welcome home to Storm's Werewolf Romance Library. If you are tired of stories where love hurts and you're ready for a love that heals, you have found your safe haven. Do me a favor, look at that subscribe button. If it's red, it means you're missing out on the best parts of the story. Click it, turn on notifications, join our membership if you want to skip the line and hear what happens next right now. And tell me in the comments, when Magnus lifted her onto that counter, did you hold your breath? Because I definitely did. Let's get back to the story. Chapter 1. The Rain and the Ruin. The rain in these woods always felt colder when you were alone, soaking through the thin cotton of my dress until the chill settled deep in my marrow. I stood at the edge of the muddy clearing, my sneakers sinking into the sludge, staring at the back of the man who was supposed to be my destiny. Caleb refused to turn around to look at me. Perhaps because he couldn't bear to witness the ruin he was causing, or perhaps because I simply wasn't worth the effort of a final glance. As the future alpha of the Crescent Peak Pack, his time was currency, and he had just decided that spending it on me was a waste. "I can't do it, Mira," Caleb said, his voice flat and carrying easily over the sound of the downpour. "I need a Luna who commands respect. I need a warrior with a lineage that strengthens our borders. You are soft. You are a liability. You are an Omega." The word hung between us like a physical weight, heavy and suffocating. Omega. In our world, it wasn't just a rank. To him, it was a verdict of uselessness. I had spent my entire life apologizing for my existence, shrinking into corners and making myself small so I wouldn't offend the powerful wolves around me. And when the moon had gifted me a fated mate, I foolishly thought my penance was over. I thought the universe had finally decided I was worthy of love. "The bond chose us," I whispered, my voice trembling so violently I wasn't sure he heard me. "Doesn't that matter? It's sacred, Caleb." "The bond is a biological trick designed to ensure breeding," Caleb scoffed, finally turning to face me. His eyes were cold, void of the heat I felt burning under my own skin, and his expression was one of mild annoyance rather than heartbreak. "I reject you, Mira of the Crescent Peak Pack. I reject the bond." I gasped as the connection between us snapped. It wasn't a sound but a sensation, a sharp, severing pain in the center of my chest that felt like a rib cracking inward. I fell to my knees in the mud, clutching my heart, gasping for air that suddenly felt too thin to breathe. Caleb looked down at me, not with pity, but with relief, as if he had just cut away a gangrenous limb. He shifted then, his russet wolf tearing through his expensive clothes, and he sprinted away into the dark, leaving me bleeding out emotionally on the forest floor. I stayed there for what felt like hours, letting the rain plaster my hair to my cheeks and mask my tears. I felt hollowed out, scraped clean of hope. I was a rejected mate, the lowest of the low, a cautionary tale for the rest of the pack to whisper about. I closed my eyes, wishing the earth would just swallow me whole, wanting to disappear and be unwritten from this cruel story. But then, the wind shifted. It didn't smell like rain or wet dog anymore. It smelled like storm clouds, crushed cedar, like something electric, like lightning striking dry earth. A low growl vibrated through the ground, so deep I felt it rattle my teeth. I opened my eyes and looked toward the tree line where Caleb had vanished. Standing at the edge of the clearing was a shadow that seemed to absorb the moonlight. As he stepped forward, the silver glow caught the sharp angles of a face etched in stone and scars. He was massive, his shoulders broad enough to block out the horizon, moving with a predator's silent grace. I stopped breathing because I knew that face. Every wolf from the coast to the mountains knew that face. Magnus, the alpha of alphas, the king. He took another step, and the atmosphere grew heavy, charged with static. I scrambled backward in the mud, my omega instincts screaming at me to bare my neck, to submit, to hide. "I didn't know you were here, Alpha," I stammered, terrified he would kill me for being on his path. "I'm leaving. I'm sorry." "Don't move," he commanded. His voice was a dark caress, not raised, yet holding more power than 1,000 shouts. I froze as Magnus closed the distance between us in 3 long strides. He towered over me, blocking out the rain, blocking out the moon. He looked down, his eyes the color of molten gold, glowing with a ferocity that stopped my heart. He didn't look at me like I was waste. He inhaled deeply, his nostrils flaring, and a shudder wrecked his massive frame. Magnus dropped to his knees in the mud. The shock of it nearly stopped my heart, because the king did not kneel for anyone. But there he was, bringing his face level with mine. He reached out, his hand large and rough, and cupped my jaw. And his thumb brushed away a raindrop, or perhaps a tear. His skin was scorching hot, a furnace against the chill of the night. "He left you," Magnus said, and it wasn't a question. It was an accusation against the universe. "I wasn't enough," I whispered, shame burning my cheeks. "I'm just an omega." "You are not just anything," Magnus growled low in his throat. "Do you know how long I have waited? Do you know how many territories I have walked, searching for this single scent?" He leaned closer until his forehead rested against mine. Mine. Chapter 2. The Monster's Chariot. The single word Magnus spoke vibrated against my skin, sinking into my bones deeper than the cold ever could. Before I could process the terrifying reality that the Alpha King had just claimed me, he moved. He didn't ask for permission, nor did he hesitate. He slid one massive arm under my knees and the other around my back, lifting me effortlessly from the mud. I instinctively wrapped my arms around his neck, burying my face in the dark, damp wool of his coat. He smelled of power and old forests, a scent so intoxicating it made my head spin. "Hold on," he murmured against my hair, his voice a rumble that resonated through his chest and into mine. He carried me through the dense woods as if I weighed nothing, his boots crunching over twigs and leaves with a rhythmic, heavy cadence. I should have been terrified. I was being abducted by a man whose reputation was built on bloodshed and ruthless conquest. But as the rain lashed down around us, I realized I wasn't getting wet anymore. He was hunching his broad shoulders, curling his body around mine to shield me from the storm. The realization stunned me into silence. Caleb had let me walk 5 miles in the rain just to break my heart, yet the monster of the mountains was using his own body as my umbrella. We emerged onto a gravel service road where a sleek, matte black vehicle sat idling. It looked like a tank disguised as a luxury SUV, its engine purring with a quiet menace. Magnus shifted my weight to one arm, a feat of strength that made my breath hitch, and opened the passenger door. Heat poured out from the interior, smelling of expensive leather and warmth. He set me down on the seat with a gentleness that was at odds with his size, his large hands lingering on my waist for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. "Buckle up," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He slammed the door, sealing me inside the warm cocoon. I watched through the rain-streaked glass as he stalked around the front of the car. He looked lethal in the headlights. His jaw clenched so tight a muscle ticked in his cheek. When he slid into the driver's seat, the car dipped under his weight. He didn't look at me. He gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white, the leather creaking under the strain. The air in the car felt electric, charged with his barely restrained temper. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice small and raspy. "Away," Magnus replied, putting the car into gear. "Far away from here. Far away from them." He peeled out onto the main road, the tires gripping the wet asphalt as we accelerated. I watched the trees blur past, realizing with a jolt of panic that I was leaving everything I had ever known. Even if my pack treated me like dirt, it was the only home I had. My things. I didn't bring anything. My clothes, my books. "I will buy you new clothes," Magnus said, his eyes fixed on the winding road ahead. "I will buy you a library, if that is what you want, but we are not going back." "Why?" I dared to ask, turning to look at his profile. He was devastatingly handsome in the dim light of the dashboard, scars and all. "Why do you care? I'm nothing to you." Magnus hit the brakes suddenly, pulling the car onto the shoulder of the road. My heart leapt into my throat as he unbuckled his seatbelt and turned toward me. The golden glow of his eyes was intense, consuming. He reached out, tracing the line of my jaw with a calloused finger, his touch searing. "You are everything," he breathed, the admission sounding like it was torn from his throat. "I smelled your grief in the wind, little wolf. It tasted like ash. I drove 3 hours across territory lines just to find the source. Do not tell me you are nothing. You are the only thing in this world that quiets the roar in my head." He leaned back, gripping the wheel again, his chest heaving as he fought for control. "Rest now. It is a long drive to the summit. And when we arrive, I promise you one thing." He glanced at me, his expression fierce and solemn. "You will never know cold again." Chapter 3. The Fortress of Blackwood. I must have dozed off, lulled by the heat and the steady hum of the engine, because when I opened my eyes, we were no longer on a highway. We were passing through immense iron gates that stood open like the jaws of a beast. A winding driveway, lined with ancient pines, led up to a structure that stole the breath from my lungs. The Blackwood estate was not a house, it was a fortress. Built from dark, jagged stone and sheets of glass, it perched on the edge of a cliff, overlooking a valley swallowed by mist. It looked impenetrable, lonely, and magnificent, just like its master. Magnus parked the car in front of the massive double doors. The rain had turned to sleet here, at the higher elevation, tapping icy fingers against the windshield. Before I could even reach for the handle, he was there, opening my door and scooping me up into his arms again. "I can walk," I protested weakly, though my legs felt like jelly. "Not in those shoes," he grunted, glancing disdainfully at my mud-caked sneakers. "You'll freeze." He carried me up the stone steps, and the heavy doors swung open before we even reached them. An older woman with silver hair stood there, flanked by a tall man in a crisp suit. They didn't speak. They simply bowed their heads low, exposing their necks in a gesture of profound submission. It wasn't fear I smelled on them, but reverence. And as Magnus carried me past them, they didn't look at him, they looked at me. Their eyes widened with recognition, and the older woman's hand flew to her mouth as she scented the air. Magnus ignored them, striding through the grand foyer. The floors were black marble, heated from beneath, and a fire the size of a small car roared in a central hearth. He didn't stop. He carried me up a sweeping staircase, down a long hallway lined with portraits of grim-faced ancestors, and kicked open a set of double doors at the end. The master suite. But it had to be. The bed was enormous, draped in dark furs and silk. A wall of windows looked out over the stormy mountains, and another fireplace crackled in the corner, casting dancing shadows on the walls. He set me down on the edge of the mattress, but he didn't step back. He stood between my spread knees, his imposing height making me feel incredibly small. "You're shivering," he noted, his voice rough. I was, but not just from the cold. Being in his private sanctuary, surrounded by his scent, was overwhelming. My dress was damp and clinging to my skin, heavy with the mud from the clearing. I'll get the floor dirty," I whispered, looking down at the pristine rug beneath his boots. "To hell with the floor," Magnus growled. His hands moved to the hem of my dress. "You need to get warm. The hypothermia is setting in." He began to lift the fabric. It wasn't a sexual advance. His movements were clinical, efficient, driven by a biological need to protect his mate. But as the cold air hit my skin and his hot knuckles brushed my thighs, panic flared in my chest. In my old pack, being undressed by an alpha meant punishment. It meant I had done something wrong and was about to pay for it. I flinched violently, jerking back and throwing my hands up to cover my face, a small whimper escaping my throat. Magnus froze. The silence that followed was absolute. The crackling of the fire seemed to stop. The wind outside ceased its howling. I peeked through my fingers, terrified that I had offended him, that the blow was coming now, because I had rejected his help. But Magnus wasn't raising his hand. He was staring at me, his hands hovering in midair where he had been helping me. His face had gone pale, and the golden fire in his eyes had dimmed into something that looked devastatingly like heartbreak. His jaw worked, grinding his teeth together as a low, mournful sound rumbled in his chest. "Who did this to you?" he asked, his voice barely audible, shaking with a suppressed rage that terrified me more than his shouting ever could. "Who taught you to fear a touch?" Chapter 4. The First Meal. The bathwater had been scalding, a stark contrast to the ice that had settled in my veins hours before, but I stayed submerged until the skin of my fingers pricked and pruned. Scrubbing the mud from my hair felt like a baptism, washing away the Omega who had knelt in the dirt and replacing her with someone cleaner, softer, but infinitely more confused. And when I finally emerged, wrapped in a towel that was thicker than the blankets I was used to, I found a pile of clothing left on the vanity. There were no Omega rags here. Instead, there was a black t-shirt that was clearly his. It swallowed me whole, the hem hitting my mid-thigh, the fabric heavy and infused with the scent of cedar and rainstorm. Pulling it on felt like stepping into an embrace, a second skin that marked me as belonging to something far powerful than myself. I crept downstairs, the house silent except for the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway. My stomach gave a treacherous growl, reminding me that I hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. Old habits died hard, so I instinctively headed toward the back of the house, looking for the kitchen entrance where the servants usually slipped in. In my old pack, I ate standing up near the pantry, picking at whatever was left after the ranked wolves had finished. I found the kitchen easily enough. It was a cavernous space of gleaming steel and dark granite, but before I could reach for a cabinet, a shadow detached itself from the doorway. Magnus was there. He had changed too, wearing dark joggers and a fitted grey Henley that strained across his chest, emphasizing the terrifying width of his shoulders. He didn't speak. He simply jerked his chin toward the dining room. I froze, my heart rate spiking. The dining room was for alphas. It was for important people. I took a step back, looking for a side table or a stool, but Magnus moved faster than I could track. His hand landed gently on the small of my back, the heat of his palm searing through the cotton of his shirt. it guiding me firmly into the grand hall. The table was set for two, but not at opposite ends. A single place setting was arranged at the head of the table, and another directly to its right. He pulled out the chair at the head, the alpha's seat, and waited. I stared at him, bewildered. He wanted me to sit there. When I hesitated, he simply pressed down on my shoulders until I sank into the velvet cushion. Then he took the seat beside me, effectively placing himself at my right hand. The symbolism was deafening. He was positioning himself as my second, my protector, not my overlord. He served the food himself, ignoring the staff who hovered in the periphery. He placed a plate in front of me that held a steak the size of my head, seared perfectly, and swimming in rich, dark juice. The smell hit me like a physical blow. I'm making my mouth water so hard it hurt. Meat was a luxury I rarely saw. Usually I subsisted on breads and root vegetables. I picked up my fork, my hand trembling slightly, and cut a small piece. Magnus didn't eat. He leaned back in his chair, one arm draped over the back, watching me with an intensity that made the air in the room feel thick and heavy. I took the first bite, and a moan of pure pleasure escaped my lips before I could stop it. The meat melted on my tongue, rich and iron-heavy. I chewed slowly, conscious of his golden eyes tracking the movement of my jaw, the way my throat worked as I swallowed. It felt intimate, almost obscenely so, to be watched while I satisfied such a primal need. I ate half the steak, the rich protein settling heavily in my empty stomach, before my old instincts kicked in. I stopped, putting the fork down, and began to push the remaining meat to the side of the plate. Magnus sat up straight, the casual slouch vanishing instantly. His eyes narrowed, focusing on the half-eaten meal. I flinched, thinking I had offended him by not finishing. But his voice, when it came, was low and rough, with a suppressed emotion I couldn't place. "Why are you stopping?" he asked, his gaze flicking from the plate to my face. I'm saving the rest," I whispered, keeping my eyes on the table. "For tomorrow. In case there isn't." I trailed off, but he understood. I saw the realization hit him like a physical blow. He knew I was hoarding food because I expected to be starved again. A low growl started deep in his chest, vibrating through the table and into my bones. He reached out, his large hand covering mine where it rested on the tablecloth, his grip tight enough to bruise if he wasn't being so careful. "Eat it all, little wolf," he commanded, his voice dark and promising violence against anyone who had ever made me feel this way. "There is no shortage here. I will burn the world to ash before I let you go hungry again." Chapter 5. Sleeping with the Wolf. The storm outside had worsened, the wind howling around the stone corners of the estate like a pack of wolves mourning the moon. The sound should have been comforting, nature's lullaby, but to me, it sounded like the echo of my rejection. Every time the thunder rolled, I saw Caleb's back turning away from me. I saw the disgust in his eyes. The master bedroom was warm, the fire banked to glowing coals, but the sheer size of the bed made me feel small and exposed. And it was a bed meant for a king, wide enough for 4 people, covered in furs that probably cost more than my entire life's earnings. I lay in the center, curled into a tight ball, clutching the pillow to my chest. I had left the lamp on, terrified of the dark, terrified that when I closed my eyes, I would wake up back in the mud. The silence of the house was oppressive. I was safe, I knew that logically, but my body hadn't caught up. My pulse was a frantic rabbit beat in my throat. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to force sleep, trying to ignore the hollowness in my chest where the bond used to be. The door handle turned. I bolted upright, gasping, pulling the duvet up to my chin. Magnus stood in the doorway. He had shed his boots and the Henley, wearing only loose sleep pants that hung low on his hips. In the dim light, the scars on his torso looked like a map of violent history, ridges of silver skin crossing his broad chest and abdomen. He didn't look at me with lust. He looked at me with concern. He paused at the threshold, sensing my panic, his golden eyes scanning the room, as if searching for a threat he could tear apart. "You are not sleeping," he stated, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to settle the frantic beating of my heart. "I can't," I admitted, my voice shaking. I keep thinking he's going to come back, that this is a mistake." Magnus stepped into the room, closing the door softly behind him. He didn't come to the bed. Instead, he walked to the large velvet armchair by the window, dragging it effortlessly across the rug until it was positioned between me and the door. He sat down, stretching his long legs out, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked like a sentinel, a statue of pure lethal protection. "Sleep, Mira," he said, his gaze fixed on the entrance. "I will keep watch. Nothing gets through that door unless it goes through me, and nothing goes through me." I watched him for a long time. The sight of him there, so large and immovable, did something to the knot of fear in my stomach. He wasn't trying to claim me or use me. He was just guarding me. But as the minutes ticked by, the distance between us felt wrong. The bed felt too big, and the chair looked too cold. The bond, the new one, the golden tether that connected us, tugged at my navel, urging me to close the gap. "Magnus?" I whispered into the gloom. He turned his head instantly, his eyes locking onto mine. "What is it? Are you in pain?" "No," I breathed, clutching the duvet tighter. "I'm lonely. The bed is too big." He went still. For a moment I thought he would refuse, that the mighty Alpha King wouldn't lower himself to comfort a broken Omega. But then he stood up. He moved to the side of the bed, the mattress dipping significantly as he sat on the edge. He didn't get under the covers. He simply lay down on top of the duvet, parallel to me, keeping a respectful distance of a few inches. "Is this better?" he asked into the darkness. "Yes," I murmured. I shifted, inching closer until my back was pressed against the barrier of the duvet, and through it I could feel the solid wall of his heat. Even through the layers of fabric, the contact was electric. It shocked through my system, chasing away the cold memory of the rain. I could hear his breathing slow down, matching mine. A rhythmic sink that lulled me toward unconsciousness. "Magnus?" "Thank you." He didn't answer with words. Instead, he reached out, his heavy hand landing on my hip through the blanket, grounding me, holding me in place. The weight of it was the most comforting thing I had ever felt. "Sleep, little wolf," he rasped. "I have you." Chapter 6. A dangerous scent. Morning light in the mountains was different. Sharper, cleaner, piercing through the heavy velvet curtains in slivers of blinding white. I woke up alone, the space beside me cool to the touch, though the pillows still smelled heavily of him. It was a scent of deep earth and ozone that made my head fuzzy with a want I didn't quite understand. I sat up, stretching, and realized I was still wearing his t-shirt. It was rumpled now, sliding off one shoulder, and smelling even more like him than it had the night before. I ventured out of the room, the house silent in the mid-morning lull. I should have been afraid to explore, but the lingering safety of the night before had emboldened me. I followed the scent of old paper and leather down a corridor I hadn't seen yesterday, drawn by the quiet allure of books. The double doors at the end were ajar, revealing a library that stole the breath from my lungs. It was 2 stories high, lined floor to ceiling with books, a rolling ladder, and a massive mahogany desk facing a wall of glass that looked out over the snow-capped peaks. I stepped inside, my bare feet sinking into the Persian rug. It smelled like him in here, concentrated, potent. This was his territory, his den. I walked to the shelves, running my fingers over the spines of leather-bound classics and worn paperbacks. I pulled one out, opening it to breathe in that distinct, dusty vanilla scent of old pages. I didn't take you for a reader. I spun around, clutching the book to my chest. Magnus was standing in the doorway, leaning against the frame. He was dressed for the day in dark jeans and a black sweater, holding a mug of coffee. But he wasn't looking at the book. He was looking at me. Specifically, he was looking at the way his shirt hung on my frame, the way the neckline slipped to reveal the slope of my shoulder, the way the hem barely grazed my thighs. He set the coffee down on a small side table without breaking eye contact. The air in the room suddenly grew thick, the temperature spiking. He pushed off the doorframe and stalked toward me, his movements fluid and predatory. I backed up until my hips hit the edge of the desk, trapping me. I was just looking, I stammered, my pulse jumping in my throat. I can put it back. Keep it, he murmured, stopping inches from me. He placed his hands on the desk on either side of my hips, caging me in. He leaned down, his face so close I could see the flecks of amber in his gold irises. He inhaled deeply, his eyes fluttering shut for a second as he breathed in the scent of his own soap and musk on my skin. "You are wearing my clothes," he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly timbre that vibrated in my chest. "Do you have any idea what that does to a male, Mira?" Seeing his mate, wrapped in his scent, standing in the heart of his territory, I didn't have anything else, I whispered, unable to look away from his mouth. "Sure, you could have asked for silk," he countered, opening his eyes. They were dark now, the pupils blown wide. "You could have asked for diamonds, but you chose my old shirt." He lifted a hand, his knuckles grazing the sensitive skin of my throat, tracing the line of my pulse. I shivered, my breath hitching, and the sound seemed to snap something inside him. He crowded closer, his hips pressing against my thighs, the hard ridge of his desire evident even through the denim. It wasn't frightening. It was intoxicating. It was the feeling of being the sole focus of the most dangerous predator in the world. "My wolf is very possessive," he warned, his lips brushing against my forehead as he spoke. "He sees you like this, smelling like us, looking like you belong here, and he loses his mind." I swallowed hard, my hands gripping the edge of the desk behind me. "What does he want to do?" Magnus groaned, a low, tortured sound that echoed in the quiet library. He pressed his forehead against mine, his breathing ragged, his restraint hanging by a thread. "He wants to lock the door," Magnus whispered, his hands tightening on the mahogany desk until the wood creaked. "He wants to keep you in this room, in my shirt, in my arms, and never let you leave. Do not tempt him, little wolf, unless you are ready to be devoured." Chapter 7. The Beta's Mistake. The tension from the library had followed us downstairs, a humming wire of energy that seemed to vibrate in the air between us. Magnus had retreated to his office to take a call from the Territory Border Patrol, leaving me to wander the grand foyer alone. It was there that I met Elias. He walked through the front doors with a casual confidence that marked him as high-ranking, shaking the melting snow from his coat. He was handsome in a rugged, approachable way, with laughing eyes and a smile that didn't look like it cost him anything. When he saw me, he didn't sneer. He didn't look through me. He stopped dead in his tracks, bowed his head slightly, and offered me a warm, genuine smile. "You must be the one who has turned the Alpha's world upside down," Elias said, his voice light and teasing. He held out a leather-bound journal. "I found this in the car. It looked like it might be yours. It was tucked in the side pocket. I thought you might want it back." My heart gave a painful lurch. It was my old diary, the only thing I had managed to shove into the door panel of Caleb's truck months ago. And somehow, that it had made its way here. It was a worthless object to anyone else, filled with bad poetry and dreams I had been too afraid to speak aloud. But Elias was holding it like it was a sacred artifact. I reached for it, my fingers brushing against his as I took the book. "Thank you," I breathed, genuinely touched by the small act of kindness. "I thought I lost this." Magnus would have torn the car apart to find it if he knew. Elias laughed, leaning casually against the banister. He's been intense since he brought you home. We've never seen him like this. The air in the room suddenly dropped 20 degrees. It wasn't a gradual cooling. It was an instant, suffocating freeze. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, pricking with a warning that had nothing to do with cold and everything to do with a predator entering the space. I heard the growl before I saw him. It was a low, subsonic rumble that started in the chest and vibrated through the floorboards, shaking the soles of my feet. Elias froze, his smile vanishing instantly as he straightened up, pulling his hands back and looking toward the top of the stairs. Magnus stood on the landing. He was utterly still, but the violence rolling off him was palpable. His eyes were no longer the warm amber they had been in the library. They were glowing shards of gold, fixed unblinkingly on the beta standing in the foyer. He didn't look like a man. He looked like a monster wearing a human skin that was rapidly becoming too tight. He descended the stairs slowly, each step heavy and deliberate, a death knell ringing in the silent house. Elias, Magnus said. The name wasn't a greeting, it was a threat. Is Alpha, Elias replied, bowing his head deeply, exposing his neck in submission. I was just returning the Luna's property. You were standing too close, Magnus snarled, reaching the bottom floor. He stalked toward us, placing his massive body directly between me and Elias, cutting off my view of the other man entirely. The growl grew louder, a continuous, jagged sound that tore from his throat. It wasn't rational. Elias was his second in command, his friend, a man he trusted with his life. But in this moment, logic had been incinerated by the raw biological imperative of a mated alpha. He smelled another male's scent near his mate, and his wolf was demanding blood. I watched Magnus's hands curl into fists at his sides, the knuckles turning white. I saw the muscles in his back bunch and coil as he prepared to strike. Elias didn't move. Knowing that fleeing would only trigger the chase instinct, the violence was seconds away. I could feel it like static electricity on my skin. I had to do something. In my old pack, intervening would have earned me a backhand, but the bond humming in my chest told me this was different. He wasn't angry at me. He was terrified of losing me. I stepped forward, closing the small distance between us, and placed my hand flat against the center of Magnus's back. I could feel his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic, erratic rhythm that betrayed his calm exterior. Magnus, I whispered, pressing my face against his shoulder blade. He was helping me. I'm safe. I'm yours. The effect was instantaneous. Magnus shuddered, a full-body tremor that ran from his shoulders to his boots. He let out a long, ragged breath, the growl tapering off into a whimper of need. He turned slowly, ignoring Elias completely now, and wrapped his arms around me, burying his face in the crook of my neck. He inhaled deeply, desperate to scrub the scent of the other male from his memory and replace it with mine. Tell him to leave, Magnus groaned against my skin, his grip tightening until it bordered on painful. Tell him to go before I forget he is my brother. I looked over Magnus's shoulder at Elias, who was already backing toward the door, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. He nodded once to me, a silent acknowledgement of the power I held, and slipped out into the cold. I turned my attention back to the man trembling in my arms. I took his face in my hands, forcing him to look at me, seeing the raw vulnerability beneath the rage. Calm down, I soothed, running my thumbs over his cheekbones. He's gone. It's just us. Magnus leaned into my touch, closing his eyes as he fought to leash the beast inside him. He grabbed my wrist, moving my hand from his cheek to his chest, pressing my palm directly over his thundering heart. Keep it there, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Anchor me, Mira, because when I look at you, I lose all reason. Chapter 8. Scars and Stories. The incident in the foyer had left Magnus unsettled, his energy jagged and restless. He couldn't seem to sit still, pacing the length of the master bedroom while I sat on the edge of the vanity stool. He needed to do something with his hands, something productive that reinforced his claim on me without resorting to violence. Eventually, he came to a stop behind me, picking up the silver hairbrush from the table. And the simple domestic object looked almost comical in his large, scarred hand, but the way he held it was reverent. "May I?" he asked, his eyes meeting mine in the mirror. I nodded, mesmerized by the reflection of us together. The massive, dark-haired king, and the pale, slender girl he seemed intent on worshipping. He began to brush my hair. He didn't just drag the bristles through the tangles. He worked with a meticulous, hypnotic rhythm. He started at the ends, gently working out the knots caused by the wind and the rain, before moving to long, sweeping strokes from the crown of my head down to my waist. The sensation was intoxicating. I had never been groomed like this. In the hierarchy of my old pack, Omegas groomed each other quickly and efficiently, always keeping one eye on the door. This was slow, this was savoring. My eyes fluttered shut, my head tipping forward as I relaxed into the touch. The sound of the bristles against my hair was a soft, rhythmic shh that quieted the anxious noise in my brain. I felt his fingers graze the nape of my neck, lifting the heavy mass of hair to brush the underside. Suddenly, his hands went still. The rhythmic motion stopped. I opened my eyes, confused, and saw him staring at the back of my neck in the mirror. His expression had shifted from focused calm to a cold, deadly stillness. He reached out, his fingertip tracing the raised, jagged line of silver skin that ran from behind my ear down to my collarbone. It was an old scar, ugly and thick, a permanent reminder of my place in the world. "What is this?" Magnus asked. His voice was devoid of all inflection, flat, and terrifyingly empty. I instinctively flinched, reaching up to cover the mark. "It's nothing," I lied, my voice small. "Just an accident from when I was younger. I fell." "Wolves do not scar from falls, Mira," Magnus said, pulling my hand away gently but firmly. "We heal. This was made with silver. This was done to keep it from healing." He leaned closer, inspecting the mark with the clinical detachment of a general assessing a battlefield, though I could see the muscle ticking violently in his jaw. "Who did this?" I looked down at my hands, shame heating my cheeks. I didn't want him to know. I didn't want him to see how weak I had been, how easily I had been broken. "It was the Gamma's son," I whispered, the memory clawing its way up my throat. I was 12. I spoke out of turn during a pack meeting. I corrected him about a hunting route. He said Omegas needed to learn that their voices didn't matter. He used his father's silver-tipped cane. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush the breath from my lungs. I waited for Magnus to tell me I should have been smarter, that I should have known my place. That was what Caleb had always said, that I provoked them by forgetting my rank. Instead, I heard a sharp snap. I looked up. The silver hairbrush lay in two pieces in Magnus's hand, the handle sheared clean off by the force of his grip. He didn't seem to notice. He dropped the broken pieces onto the vanity table, the clatter echoing like a gunshot in the quiet room. He didn't look at me. He looked through the mirror, staring at a ghost I couldn't see, his eyes burning with a cold, blue-hot fire. "He hurt you," Magnus said. It wasn't a question. And it was a statement of fact that he was struggling to comprehend. "He took a weapon to a child, to my mate." "It was a long time ago," I said quickly, reaching back to touch his arm, terrified by the lethal stillness radiating off him. "It doesn't hurt anymore." Magnus turned me around on the stool so that I was facing him. He fell to his knees again, burying his face in the hollow of my throat, right over the scar. He kissed the raised skin, his lips soft and apologetic, as if he could erase the history with his worship. When he pulled back, his face was wet, not with tears, but with a sweat born of pure, agonizing restraint. "They will bleed for this," he promised, his voice a low, broken vow that sent a shiver down my spine. "Every single one of them, who watched and did nothing. I will burn their legacy to the ground. And I will write your name in the ashes. You think it doesn't hurt anymore, Mira? It hurts me. It hurts me to breathe, knowing that air is shared with the monster who touched you." Chapter 9. The Library Sanctuary. To distract him from the dark path his thoughts were taking, a path that smelled of blood and war, I led Magnus out of the bedroom and back to the library. It was the only place in the house that felt neutral, a sanctuary of ideas rather than instincts. I pulled him toward the oversized leather sofa in front of the fireplace, pushing him down until he sat. He looked exhausted, the weight of his own rage pressing down on his shoulders. "Read to me," he said, surprising me. He lay down, resting his head in my lap, his long legs stretching out over the armrest. It was a position of ultimate vulnerability for an alpha, exposing his throat, blinding himself to the room, trusting me completely with his safety. I reached for the book I had abandoned earlier, a collection of old folklore, and began to read. My voice was shaky at first, but as the rhythm of the words took over, I found a cadence that seemed to soothe him. I read about ancient forests and star-crossed lovers, my hand absent-mindedly carding through his thick, dark hair. I felt the tension slowly bleed out of him. His breathing deepened, the hard lines of his face softening until he looked less like a king and more like a man who just wanted to rest. "Do you like stories?" I asked softly during a pause between chapters. "I like your voice," he murmured, his eyes closed. "It sounds like home." He shifted, turning his face toward my stomach, inhaling my scent through the fabric of the shirt. "What do you dream of, Mira? Besides survival? What did you want before the world told you to stop wanting?" The question caught me off guard. No one had ever asked me about my dreams. In the Crescent Peak Pack, an Omega's dream was to serve quietly and hope to be ignored. But here, in this warm room with the most powerful wolf in the world, resting his head on my thighs, the old barriers felt flimsy. I wanted to write, I confessed, the secret feeling fragile in the air. I wanted to write stories where the quiet girls saved themselves, where the monsters weren't villains, just misunderstood. I used to hide scraps of paper under my mattress with scenes I'd thought up while scrubbing the floors. Magnus opened his eyes, but they weren't glowing with rage anymore. They were warm, liquid gold, filled with a profound sadness for the time I had lost. "And did you save them?" he asked. "The scraps of paper?" "No," I whispered. "Caleb found them. He burned them." He said daydreaming made me slow at my chores. Magnus sat up slowly. He didn't growl this time. The rage was there, but it had transmuted into something solid and constructive. He reached out, cupping my cheek with a hand that could crush stone, but chose to hold me like water. "Then we will start over," he said firmly. "You will write, Mira. You will write until your fingers ache and your shelves are full. You will tell your stories, and I will be the first to listen." "It's silly," I dismissed, looking away. "It's just a childish wish." "Nothing you want is silly," Magnus corrected, turning my face back to his. "You are my queen. If you want to write, I will buy you a publishing house. If you want to paint, I will build you a gallery. Your dreams are not dust here. They are the blueprints for the life we are going to build." He leaned in, brushing his lips against mine in a feather-light kiss that promised a future I hadn't dared to imagine. "Write your stories, Mira," he whispered against my mouth. "I will build you a world where they all come true. And I promise you, in this story, no one burns the pages." Chapter 10. Fever Pitch. The air in the house had changed, shifting from the comfortable warmth of a home into something heavy and electric, like the pressure drop before a hurricane. I woke up alone again, but this time the absence of Magnus didn't feel like a polite retreat. It felt like a gaping wound. The bond between us, usually a golden hum in the back of my mind, had turned into a jagged, pulling ache that throbbed with every beat of my heart. It wasn't just my pain, it was his. I could feel a phantom fever burning beneath my skin, a restlessness that made my hands shake and my wolf-pace circles in my chest. Something was wrong, and the silence of the estate was no longer peaceful. It was a cage. I found Greta in the kitchen, her usual bustling energy replaced by a nervous stillness as she stared out the window at the gray sky. When I asked where he was, she didn't look at me, busying herself with a perfectly clean countertop. She told me the alpha was indisposed and that I should stay in the East Wing for the day. Her evasion only sharpened the panic rising in my throat. In my old pack, it's an indisposed alpha usually meant violence or a challenge for dominance, but this felt different. It felt biological. The scent of the house had deepened, the notes of cedar and rainstorm becoming so concentrated they tasted like copper on my tongue. It was the scent of a male on the edge, a predator whose instincts were bleeding out of control. I ignored Greta's warnings and followed the pull of the bond. It led me away from the bright open spaces of the living quarters and down a long stone-lined corridor that led to his private study. With every step I took toward the heavy oak doors at the end of the hall, the air grew hotter and harder to breathe. It was suffocating, thick with pheromones that made my knees weak and my head spin. My own body was reacting to it, a flush spreading across my skin that had nothing to do with the ambient temperature. I could hear him inside, the heavy thud of pacing boots, the sound of glass shattering, and a low, continuous growl that sounded like a wounded animal trapped in a snare. I reached the door and pressed my palms against the wood, the vibrations from his growls traveling up my arms. The wood was warm, as if the fire inside him was radiating through the solid oak. "Magnus!" I called out, my voice trembling, but loud enough to cut through the noise of his torment. The sounds inside stopped instantly. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the growling had been. I could feel him on the other side, sensing me, his presence pressing against the barrier like a physical weight. "Go away, Mira," he rasped, his voice unrecognizable. Then it sounded like gravel grinding together, stripped of all humanity. "Get away from the door, now!" "I'm not leaving," I said, leaning my forehead against the grain of the wood. The bond tugged violently, urging me to tear the door down, to get to him, to soothe the fire that was consuming him. "You're in pain. I can feel it. Let me in." "You don't know what you are asking," he groaned, and I heard the sound of a heavy body hitting the wall, as if he was struggling to stay upright. "The fever is here, the pre-rut. My control is. It is slipping. If I see you, if I smell you, I will not be able to stop myself. I will hurt you." "You would never hurt me," I insisted, my fear dissolving into a fierce protective resolve. "You told me you would burn the world before you let me suffer. Do you think I want to stand out here while you burn alone?" I turned the handle, but it was locked. Frustration clawed at my chest. I wasn't the weak Omega girl anymore. I was his mate, and his suffering was my enemy. I pounded on the door with my fist, the sound echoing sharply in the hallway. "Open the door, Magnus. I am not afraid of your wolf. I am not afraid of you." There was a moment of stillness, a heartbeat where the entire world seemed to hold its breath. Then the lock clicked, with a sound like a gunshot. The door was ripped open so violently, it slammed into the stone wall, cracking the plaster. Magnus stood in the threshold, and for a second, I didn't recognize him. His shirt was torn open, buttons missing, revealing a chest heaving with exertion and slick with sweat. His hair was wild. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, trembling with the effort to not reach for me. But it was his eyes that froze me in place. The warm amber was gone, entirely swallowed by a glowing neon gold that burned with a hunger so raw, so primal, it felt like it could strip the skin from my bones. He looked ruined. He looked magnificent. He loomed over me, breathing hard, the scent of his arousal and his aggression hitting me like a physical wave. He didn't step back to let me in. He leaned down, his face inches from mine, his teeth bared in a snarl that was half warning, half plea. The heat radiating off him was scorching, a fever that promised to consume us both if I took one more step. "Run, Mira," he warned, his voice a dark, vibrating command that sent a jolt of electricity straight to my core. "I gave you a chance. I tried to lock you out, but now that I have seen you, I cannot be gentle tonight." Chapter 11. The Chase. He told me to run, and for the first time in my life, the command didn't make me feel like prey. It made me feel like a challenge. In my old pack, running was an act of desperation, a frantic scramble to escape punishment or mockery. But looking into Magnus's glowing golden eyes, I realized this was different. He wasn't trying to drive me away. He was begging me to give him an outlet for the wild, feverish energy that was tearing him apart. He needed the hunt, the pursuit, the primal satisfaction of closing the distance between us. And deep down in the marrow of my bones, I realized I needed it too. I didn't want to be the fragile thing behind a locked door anymore. I wanted to be the reason the king lost his breath. And I turned and bolted, not toward the safety of the guest wing, but straight for the double-glass doors at the end of the corridor that led out to the walled garden. A sound tore from his throat behind me, half groan, half laugh, followed by the heavy, thundering cadence of boots hitting the stone floor. He was coming. The thrill of it shot through my veins like champagne, hotter and more intoxicating than any fear I had ever known. I burst through the doors, the cold mountain air slapping my flushed cheeks, and scrambled down the stone steps into the damp twilight. The garden was a sprawling maze of dormant hedges and ancient oak trees, the ground carpeted in wet, decaying leaves that smelled of autumn and deep earth. I didn't have a plan, so I just ran, my feet slipping on the wet grass, my lungs burning with the sharp intake of cold air. I could hear him gaining on me, his movements heavy and deliberate. I knew instinctively that he wasn't using his full speed. If he were, he would have caught me before I even reached the grass. He was savoring the chase, letting the anticipation build, letting me feel the wildness of the night. A twig snapped to my left, and I veered right, dodging behind the massive trunk of a weeping willow, pressing my back against the rough bark as I tried to quiet my breathing. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with the static of the bond, and I clapped a hand over my mouth to stifle a giggle that was bubbling up from my chest. Suddenly, the heavy warmth of his presence wrapped around the tree before I could even blink. He was there. I squealed, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy that I hadn't known I was capable of making, and bolted again, sprinting toward the center of the lawn. But this time he was done playing with his food. I made it 3 steps before an arm like a steel band wrapped around my waist, lifting me off my feet. The momentum took us both down, but we didn't hit the ground hard. He twisted in midair with impossible grace, taking the brunt of the impact with his own back, cushioning me against his broad chest as we rolled through the wet leaves. We came to a stop with him hovering over me, pinning me to the earth with the sheer weight of his body. The world was spinning, a blur of gray sky and dark branches, but he was the only thing in focus. He was panting, his breath coming in ragged clouds of steam in the cold air, his hair wild and damp with the mist. The golden glow in his eyes hadn't faded, but the frightening edge was gone, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated adoration. The weight of him was heavy, pressing me into the damp earth, grounding me in a way I had never felt before. The fever that had been consuming him seemed to have transferred to me. I was burning up, despite the chill of the mud seeping into my clothes, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his. He brushed a wet leaf from my cheek, his fingers trembling slightly with the effort to be gentle after such a burst of primal energy. He looked at me as if I were a riddle he had finally solved, his expression open and unguarded. The chase had burned off the aggression, leaving only the raw, exposed nerve of his desire. "You stopped running," he murmured, his voice rough and deep, vibrating against my chest where our bodies were fused together. "You could have made it to the gate. You could have hidden in the greenhouse, but you stopped." I looked up at him, at the man who had turned a hunt into a game, just to see me smile, and realized that I was done running from my fate. "Because I didn't want to get away," I whispered, reaching up to tangle my fingers in his hair and pull him down. I wanted to be caught. Chapter 12. Skin Hunger. We left a trail of wet footprints and crushed leaves across the pristine marble of the foyer, but for the first time since arriving at Blackwood, I didn't flinch at the mess. The chase had broken something open inside me, shattering the terrified Omega, who apologized for her own existence, and replacing her with a creature who understood the wildness of the man walking beside me. Magnus didn't seem to care about the mud either. His arm remained clamped around my waist, a heavy, heated weight that anchored me to his side as we ascended the stairs. He wasn't dragging me, but he wasn't letting go, his touch possessive and constant, as if he feared that if he released me, I might dissolve into the mist outside. The fever that had driven him to madness earlier had settled into a simmering, potent heat that radiated from his soaked clothes, warming the chill that clung to my skin. Inside the master suite, the air was still thick with the scent of his earlier distress, but now it was mingling with the smell of the coming storm and the damp earth on our skin. Magnus guided me straight to the bathroom, a cavernous space of dark slate and heated stone that felt more like a private spa than a washroom. He turned the taps on the massive soaking tub, the sound of rushing water filling the silence. Ice and steam began to rise instantly, curling around us like a protective veil. He didn't speak as he turned to me, his hands moving to the buttons of my ruined shirt. His fingers, usually so steady, trembled slightly, betraying the immense effort it took to leash the power coiling beneath his skin. He peeled the wet fabric away from my shoulders with a reverence that made my breath hitch, treating the mud-streaked skin beneath as if it were spun from gold. When we were both stripped down to nothing but skin and scars, the vulnerability should have been paralyzing. But under his gaze, I felt only worshipped. He stepped into the water first, the heat of it rising in visible waves, and sat back against the dark stone, extending a hand to me. The tub was enormous, easily large enough for two, yet when I stepped in and settled between his legs, the water rising to my chin, it felt incredibly intimate. I leaned back against his chest, the solid wall of muscle supporting me, and let out a long, ragged sigh as the heat seeped into my frozen bones. Magnus wrapped his arms around me beneath the water, his skin scorching even through the scalding temperature, pulling me flush against him until there was no space left for the water to flow between our backs and chests. He reached for a soft cloth and a bar of soap that smelled of sandalwood and cream, working up a rich lather before he began to wash me. This wasn't a functional act of cleaning, it was a ritual of claiming. He started at my shoulders, the cloth moving in slow, heavy circles, washing away the dirt of the garden and the remnants of my old life. He traced the line of my collarbone, the slope of my arm, and the sensitive skin of my palms, his touch erasing the memory of every cold, unloving hand that had ever pushed me away. I closed my eyes, overwhelmed by the sheer sensory overload of it, the sound of the water lapping against the stone, the heavy thud of his heart beating against my spine, and the friction of his rough palms against my soap-slicked skin. I turned in his arms, needing to touch him back, needing to feed the hunger that had been hollowing me out for years. I took the cloth from his hand and pressed it to his chest, cleaning the mud from the ridges of his scars, tracing the history of violence written on his body with a gentle touch. He groaned low in his throat, his head falling back against the rim of the tub. his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. The steam had dampened his dark hair, making it curl against his forehead, and his lashes were spiked with moisture. He looked devastatingly open, a king undone by the simple intimacy of being cared for. "I have never been touched like this," he admitted, his voice a rough vibration that traveled through the water and into my chest. "I am used to hands that take, Mira. Hands that strike, or hands that beg for power. But your hands—" He caught my wrist, stopping my movement, and brought my wet hand to his mouth. He kissed the center of my palm, then the sensitive, frantic pulse point at my wrist, his lips lingering there as he inhaled sharply. His golden eyes opened, dark with a need that went far beyond the physical, a desperate, hollow ache that mirrored my own. "I have been empty for a century," he whispered against my skin, his teeth grazing the delicate vein. "But now, I am starving for you." Chapter 13. The Declaration. The transition from the sanctuary of the water to the warmth of the bedroom felt like moving between two different dreams, both equally fragile and terrifyingly beautiful. Magnus had carried me from the bath, wrapped in a towel so large it trailed on the floor, settling me on the thick rug before the hearth, as if I were made of spun glass. The fire was roaring now, casting long dancing shadows against the stone walls, painting his skin in shades of amber and bronze as he moved to add another log to the grate. He was clad only in loose trousers, his chest bare and gleaming in the firelight, the dampness from the bath making his skin look burnished. I sat there, clutching the towel to my chest, watching the muscles in his back shift and coil, overwhelmed by the sheer, undeniable reality of him. He turned back to me, but instead of the predatory hunger I had seen in the garden or the desperate need I had tasted in the tub, his expression was solemn. He picked up a second towel and knelt behind me, beginning to dry my hair with slow, methodical motions. The rhythm was hypnotic, the rough terry cloth massaging my scalp while the heat of the fire warmed my face. But there was a tension radiating from him that I couldn't ignore. It wasn't the fever of the pre-rut anymore. It was something heavier, a weight of conscience that seemed to be bowing his broad shoulders. He stopped suddenly, his hands lingering on my damp shoulders, his thumbs tracing the line of my neck with a hesitation that made my heart stutter. "I need to tell you something," he murmured, his voice low and vibrating against my back. "And I need you to listen without the bond clouding your judgment." I turned to face him, the towel slipping slightly, but he didn't look at my exposed skin. He looked strictly into my eyes, his golden gaze intense and searching. He reached out, taking my hands in his thumbs sweeping over my knuckles. "I did not bring you here just because the moon told me to," he said, the confession sounding like it was being torn from his throat. "When I found you in the woods, I smelled the mate bond, yes. It is biological. It is undeniable. But that is not why I knelt in the mud." He took a breath, his grip on my hands tightening. "I watched you with Elias in the foyer. I watched you stand between a lethal alpha in a rage and a man who couldn't defend himself. You didn't do it because you were strong. You did it because you were kind. You have been broken by this world, Mira, beaten down and rejected, yet you have not become cruel. That is not biology. That is who you are." He released one of my hands to cut my cheek, his touch searing. "I did not claim you for your scent. I claimed you for your soul, because in a world of monsters, you are the only thing that is pure." Tears pricked my eyes, hot and fast, blurring the sight of his earnest face. No one had ever seen me. They saw an omega, a servant, a mistake. Magnus saw a queen, but he wasn't finished. He pulled back slightly, putting a painful inch of distance between us. "But I know who I am," he continued, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I am a weapon. I am violence and territory and blood. You deserve peace, and I am a storm. If you want to leave, But if you want to walk out those doors and find a life that is quiet and safe, a life where you are not hunted or burdened by a king's wars, I will let you go. I will drive you anywhere you want. I will give you everything you need, and I will never come for you. The silence that followed was deafening, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the thunderous beating of my own heart. He was offering me an escape. He was offering to rip his own soul in half, to give me a choice, placing my freedom above his own survival. It was the most devastatingly romantic thing anyone had ever done for me. He was waiting for my answer, his body rigid, bracing for the blow of my departure. He expected me to run. He expected me to choose safety over the fire. I looked at the man who had carried me through the rain, who had brushed my hair, who had chased me through the leaves just to hear me laugh. I looked at the scars on his chest and knew that I was the only one who could ever soothe them. I didn't want safety. I didn't want quiet. I wanted the storm. I reached up, threading my fingers into his damp hair, and pulled his face down to mine. I didn't speak. I simply crashed my lips against his. It wasn't a tentative kiss, and it wasn't a question. It was a collision, a fierce, demanding claiming that poured all my certainty into him. I felt him freeze for a split second before a groan tore from his chest, and he melted into me, his arms wrapping around me to crush me against him. I kissed him until we were both breathless, until the doubt was incinerated by the heat between us. I pulled back just an inch, resting my forehead against his, breathing in the air he exhaled. "You are not a monster," I whispered fiercely, staring into his stunned golden eyes. "You are my peace. I don't want to leave, Magnus. I don't want to go anywhere unless you are there." I pressed my hand over his heart, feeling it race beneath my palm. "I choose you, my king, my mate." Chapter 14. The Claiming. The moment the words left my lips, the air in the room seemed to shatter, the tension breaking into a storm of raw, unbridled need. Magnus didn't just kiss me, he consumed me, his mouth moving over mine with a desperation that tasted of centuries of waiting. The towel I had been clutching fell away, forgotten on the rug, and for the first time I felt no shame in my nakedness, only a fierce pride that this powerful, trembling creature belonged to me. He worshipped every inch of skin he exposed, his hands rough and hot as they mapped the curves of my body, leaving trails of fire in their wake. There was no hesitation now, no fear of the monster he claimed to be. There was only the undeniable magnetic pull of two souls crashing together to form a single unbreakable entity. He lowered me back onto the thick fur rug, the firelight casting dancing shadows across the planes of his face, highlighting the raw intensity of his golden eyes. He hovered over me, his massive frame blocking out everything else in the room, creating a world that consisted only of his heat, his scent, and the heavy rhythmic thud of his heart against my own. He moved with a reverence that brought tears to my eyes, treating me as if I were something holy, something that could shatter if he wasn't careful, even as his own control hung by the thinnest of threads. Every touch was a promise, every kiss a vow of protection that seeped deep into my marrow. The intimacy was overwhelming, a tidal wave of sensation that washed away the last remnants of the lonely, rejected girl I used to be and replaced her with a woman who was cherished beyond measure. As the heat between us climbed higher, spiraling into a fever pitch that blurred the edges of my vision, I felt the shift in him. The man was still there, loving and tender, but the wolf was rising, demanding the ancient right that would bind us for eternity. Magnus buried his face in the curve of my neck, his breath hot and ragged against the sensitive skin where my scent was strongest. A low, vibrating growl rumbled in his chest, a sound of pure possessiveness that resonated through my entire body. I didn't flinch. Instead, I tilted my head back, baring my throat to him in the ultimate act of trust and submission. I wanted this. I wanted the permanence of his mark, the physical proof that I was his, and he was mine, a seal that no law or pack politics could ever break. Mira, he groaned against my pulse point, his voice thick and strained. If I do this, there is no going back. We are one. Forever. Are you sure? Claim me, I whispered, my voice steady despite the trembling of my limbs. Make it permanent, Magnus. I don't want to go back. He didn't wait. He sank his teeth into the junction of my shoulder and neck, a sharp, stinging pain that lasted only a heartbeat before it was swept away by a flood of molten gold. It wasn't just a physical sensation, it was a metaphysical collision. I gasped as the bond exploded wide open, tearing down the walls of my mind and flooding me with the essence of him. It was like standing in the center of a supernova. I felt his absolute devotion, a love so vast and terrifying, it stole the breath from my lungs. I felt his protective fury, a promise to destroy anything that threatened me. I felt his loneliness, a deep, aching void that was suddenly, violently filled by my presence. Our souls didn't just touch, they knitted together, wrapping around each other like vines, fusing until I couldn't tell where I ended. And he began. The pleasure was blinding, a white-hot intensity that arched my back off the rug as we moved together, finally completing the union that the stars had orchestrated. It was slow and agonizingly sweet, a rhythm as old as the mountains outside, driven by the pulse of the earth itself. I clung to him, unanchoring myself in the storm, feeling the exact moment he surrendered completely to me, pouring everything he was into the vessel of my heart. We were no longer two separate beings navigating a cruel world. We were a dyad, a force of nature, a new constellation burning in the dark sky. As the tidal wave receded, leaving us tangled and breathless in the glow of the dying fire, the silence in the room felt different. It wasn't empty anymore. The space inside my head, usually filled with my own anxious thoughts, was now humming with a warm golden presence that felt like sunlight. I blinked, trying to catch my breath, my hand resting over the fresh mark on my neck that was already beginning to heal. And then, I heard it. It wasn't a spoken word, but a thought, clear, resonant, and echoing directly in the center of my mind. It was Magnus's voice, but stripped of all guards, raw and echoing with a profound relief. Thank you, the voice whispered in my head, over and over, a litany of gratitude that brought fresh tears to my eyes. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Chapter 15. The Morning After. Waking up that morning felt less like rising from sleep and more like being born into a new body, one that was finally, irrevocably whole. The winter sun was streaming through the heavy velvet curtains, painting stripes of brilliant white light across the tangled mess of furs and limbs on the bed. But the warmth I felt didn't come from the hearth or the sun. It came from the golden, humming tether that now lived in the center of my chest, a constant, resonant vibration that connected me to the sleeping giant beside me. For the first time in my life, the silence in my head was gone, replaced by the soothing, subconscious rhythm of Magnus's existence, his contentment, his fierce protectiveness, and the deep, ocean-heavy calm of his rest. I lay there for a long time, just breathing in the scent of cedar and musk that clung to the sheets, tracing the fresh, sensitive skin where his mark now claimed me, marveling at the fact that the crushing weight of loneliness I had carried for 20 years had simply evaporated. I tried to slip out of bed to start the day, moving with the practiced stealth of an omega used to being invisible, but the moment my foot touched the cold floor, a heavy arm clamped around my waist and dragged me back into the heat. Magnus didn't even open his eyes. He just grunted a low, satisfied sound and buried his face in the crook of my neck, inhaling deeply as if my scent was the oxygen he needed to survive. We lay like that for an hour, drifting in a haze of lazy touches and soft kisses, until the rumble of his empty stomach finally forced us to move. When we finally went downstairs, the house felt different. It wasn't a fortress of solitude anymore, but a home that belonged to us equally. I walked into the kitchen, intending to make breakfast, but instead of retreating to his office or waiting to be served, Magnus followed me. He leaned against the counter, wearing nothing but low-slung sweatpants, watching me with a predatory focus that made my hands shake as I reached for the skillet. But it wasn't fear that made me tremble. It was the intoxicating realization that I wasn't serving him. I was caring for him. As I cracked eggs into a bowl, he moved behind me, Asa wrapping his massive arms around my waist and resting his chin on top of my head, effectively trapping me against the counter. He stole a piece of crisp bacon from the plate, pressing a kiss to my temple as he chewed, his chest vibrating against my back with a low, happy hum that I could feel echoing in my own bones. "You feel different," he murmured, his hands splaying over my stomach, his thumbs rubbing soothing circles against the fabric of his shirt that I was still wearing. "Your scent has changed. It's deeper, stronger." "I feel different," I admitted, leaning back into him. It was true. The constant gnawing fatigue that usually plagued me was gone, replaced by a vitality that I knew didn't belong to me. I felt durable. I felt dangerous. "I don't feel small anymore. Is this the bond?" "It is us," Magnus corrected, turning me in his arms so that I faced him, ignoring the food sizzling on the stove. He lifted me easily to sit on the edge of the granite island, stepping between my knees to bring us chest to chest. "You are sharing my strength now, Mira. My endurance. My power. You were never weak. You were just starving for a connection that could sustain you. You will never be small again." We ate right there on the kitchen island, sharing the plate, trading bites and soft words, existing in a bubble of domestic perfection that felt too good to be true. I was laughing at something he said, a rare, deep sound that surprised even me, when the atmosphere in the room suddenly shattered. The golden hum of the bond spiked with a sharp, jagged warning, and Magnus went rigid, his head snapping toward the front of the house. As I felt his mood shift instantly, from playful lover to lethal protector, the air around us growing heavy with the metallic tang of aggression. "Someone is at the gate," he growled, sliding off the stool and positioning himself in front of me, shielding me from a threat I couldn't even see yet. A moment later, the kitchen door swung open, and Elias walked in. He looked pale, his usual easy smile gone, replaced by a grim line of tension. He held a thick, cream-colored envelope in his hand, holding it by the very corner, as if it were contaminated. He didn't look at me. He looked strictly at Magnus, his throat working as he swallowed nervously. "Alpha," Elias said, his voice tight. "A courier just arrived at the perimeter. They wouldn't cross the boundary line. They left this." Magnus didn't take the letter. He stared at it, his nostrils flaring as he scented the paper from across the room. A low, thunderous snarl ripped from his throat, shaking the glassware in the cabinets. I slid off the counter, stepping up beside him, and the smell hit me. A cloying, familiar scent of old parchment and arrogance. "Who is it from?" I whispered, though dread was already pooling in my stomach. Elias placed the letter on the table and took a step back. "It's from the Crescent Peak Pack, Alpha. It's signed by Caleb's father. He says he has received word that you are harboring a fugitive from his pack, and he wishes to negotiate the terms of her return before he involves the council." Chapter 16. The Final Rejection. The growl that tore from Magnus's throat was a sound of pure, unadulterated violence, but a vibration so deep it rattled the crystal in the cabinets and sent a tremor through the floorboards beneath my bare feet. He crumpled the heavy cream envelope in his fist, the expensive paper turning to dust under the pressure of his grip, and for a terrifying second, his eyes flashed that neon radioactive gold that promised death. He was already moving toward the door, his movements blurring with supernatural speed, his intent clear. He was going to tear the throat out of the messenger and send the pieces back to Caleb's father as his only counteroffer. In the past, his rage would have sent me scrambling for cover, terrified of the fallout. But today, looking at the man who would burn the world to keep me warm, I felt only a fierce, icy calm settle over my bones. "No," I said, the word ringing out clearly in the chaotic energy of the kitchen. I didn't shout, but the command held a weight I had never possessed before. I stepped into his path, placing my hand flat against the center of his heaving chest, right over the tattoo of scars that marred his skin. He stopped instantly, though his body was vibrating with the force of a checked weapon. He looked down at me, his nostrils flaring, as he fought the urge to shift right there on the tile. His wolf demanding blood for the insult of them, thinking they could own me. "You will not kill him, Magnus. You will not give them the satisfaction of a war. They want to negotiate for a runaway Omega. Fine. Let them see what they really lost." He searched my face, looking for fear, looking for the girl who used to flinch at loud noises. But she was gone. In her place stood his mate, fortified by the golden bond that hummed between us. A woman who had borrowed the strength of a king and made it her own. Slowly, the murderous haze in his eyes receded, replaced by a burning pride that was almost hotter than the rage. He nodded once, a sharp jerk of his chin, and stepped back to strip off his sweatpants. He didn't speak, but the air shimmered around him, bones cracking and reshaping in a fluid, terrifying dance, until the man was gone, and a massive midnight-colored wolf stood in the kitchen. He was breathless in his size, his head coming up to my chest, his golden eyes fixed on me with absolute devotion. I buried my hand in the thick fur at his neck, feeling the coarse texture and the radiating heat, and together we walked out into the snow. The walk to the main gates felt like a coronation procession. The air was biting cold, but with my hand buried in the flank of the most feared predator on the continent, I felt invincible. We rounded the final bend of the driveway to see a sleek sedan parked just outside the iron bars. A man I recognized, a mid-ranking enforcer from Crescent Peak who used to kick dirt on my shoes when I walked by, was leaning against the hood, looking bored. When he saw us, his boredom vanished. He scrambled upright, his eyes widening as he took in the sheer size of the beast walking beside me, a predator that made the wolves of his pack look like stray dogs. I didn't stop until I was pressing against the iron gate, my fingers curled around the cold metal bars. Magnus stood silently at my hip, a living shadow, though a low rumble constant in his chest that warned the enforcer that one wrong move would be his last. The man swallowed hard, looking from the massive wolf to me, trying to find the cowering servant he remembered. "Mira!" the enforcer stammered, trying to regain his composure, but failing miserably as the scent of pure alpha power rolled off us in waves. "The alpha, Caleb's father, he is generous. He is willing to overlook your theft of pack resources if you return immediately. The car is warm. Get in." "Theft?" I asked, my voice carrying easily over the wind. "I took nothing but the clothes on my back, and even those were rags. Tell your alpha that I have no debts to settle." "You belong to Crescent Peak," the man snapped, his fear making him reckless. "You are an Omega. You don't have the right to leave unless dismissed. And if you don't come now, the council will—" "The council will do nothing," I interrupted, my voice dropping to a register that mirrored Magnus's own growl. I felt the bond surge, flooding me with authority, making my spine straighter and my eyes flash. Because I am not a fugitive Omega. I am the mate of the Alpha King. I am the Luna of the Blackwood estate. And I am telling you to leave my territory before my mate decides he is hungry. The enforcer took a step back, his face draining of all color as the reality of my words hit him. He looked at Magnus, who stepped forward and let out a roar that shook the snow from the trees, a sound of absolute dominance that triggered the flight instinct in every living thing within a mile. The man didn't wait for permission. He scrambled into his car, the tires spinning on the ice as he reversed frantically and sped away, fleeing the monster he had dared to insult. I watched the taillights disappear, feeling the last heavy chain of my past shatter into dust. I was free, not because I ran, but because I stood my ground. I turned to the massive wolf beside me, burying my face in his neck, inhaling the scent of storm and cedar. The air shimmered again, the heat spiking, and suddenly strong human arms were wrapping around me, pulling me into a hard, desperate embrace. Magnus was back, naked and shivering, not from cold, but from the adrenaline of the moment, pressing his forehead against mine. "You were magnificent," he whispered, his voice rough with awe, his hands framing my face as he looked at me like I was the only star in his sky. "They came looking for a servant. Anyan, they found a ruler." He kissed me, a searing claiming seal on my lips that promised this victory was only the beginning. Long live the Queen. Chapter 17. Home. The snow had been falling for 3 days straight, blanketing the Blackwood estate in a hush of heavy, pristine white that made the world outside feel miles away. In my old life, winter was a season of dread, a time of drafty floorboards, aching joints, and the constant gnawing fear of scarcity. But here, in the heart of the Alpha King's territory, winter was nothing more than a beautiful backdrop for the warmth we had created. I sat tucked into the corner of the massive velvet sofa in the library, a thick cashmere throw draped over my legs, my journal balanced on my knees. The fire in the hearth was a roaring beast of orange and gold, it cracking and popping in a rhythm that matched the scratching of my pen against the paper. I was writing. Not secret scraps hidden under a mattress, but a real story, one about a girl who walked into the woods and found a monster who turned out to be a savior. Magnus was at the other end of the sofa, theoretically reviewing territory reports on a tablet, but his attention was nowhere near the borders. His legs were stretched out, heavy and solid, his bare feet resting on the coffee table, while his head was pillowed on my thigh. One of his large hands rested possessively on my calf beneath the blanket, his thumb tracing slow, rhythmic circles against my skin. It was a touch that grounded me, a constant subconscious reminder that I was here, I was real, and I was his. Every few minutes he would turn his face inward, pressing a kiss to the fabric of my leggings or inhaling the scent of my skin, grounding himself in my presence before returning to his work. The bond between us had settled from the raging wildfire of the claiming into a steady molten hum, a golden sun that lived in the center of my chest, radiating a profound sense of safety that I still, months later, sometimes struggled to believe was mine. I paused in my writing, lifting the pen to watch the snow swirl against the floor-to-ceiling glass. The silence in the room was absolute, but it wasn't empty. It was full of him. It was full of us. I looked down at Magnus, tracing the strong line of his jaw with my eyes, the way his dark lashes cast shadows on his cheekbones. He must have felt the weight of my gaze because his eyes opened slowly, the gold within them bright and clear, stripped of all the shadows that had haunted him when we first met. He didn't speak immediately. He just looked at me with that devastating open adoration that still made my breath hitch. He set the tablet aside, shifting his weight until he could reach up and tangle his fingers in the ends of my hair. "You are thinking too loud," he murmured, his voice a low rumble that vibrated against my leg. "The bond is buzzing with it. What is on your mind, little wolf?" "I was just thinking about the quiet," I admitted, setting my journal down on the side table. I reached down to weave my fingers through his dark hair, scratching lightly at his scalp the way I knew he loved. I used to hate the silence. It meant I was invisible. It meant no one cared enough to speak to me. But now, with you, the silence feels like a shield. That it feels like the rest of the world has stopped, and we are the only two people left in it. Magnus closed his eyes, leaning into my touch with a heavy sigh of contentment. He pulled my hand from his hair and brought it to his lips, kissing the knuckles one by one, then turning my hand over to press a lingering kiss to the center of my palm. The sensation sent a warm shiver racing down my spine, a reminder that even in this domestic peace, the fire between us was always just beneath the surface. He sat up slowly, the blanket pooling around his waist, and shifted until he was hovering over me, bracketing my body with his arms against the cushions. The playfulness was gone, replaced by a fierce, solemn intensity. "You are not invisible," he whispered, his forehead resting against mine. "You are the center of everything. You are the sun this house orbits around. Do you know that? When you are in a room, I cannot see anything else. When you are writing, I cannot focus on wars or borders, because the sound of your breathing is the only thing that matters." He brushed his thumb over my lower lip, his gaze dropping to my mouth. "Are you happy, Mira? Truly, I took you from everything you knew. I brought you to a fortress of ice and stone. I need to know that I am enough for you." I looked at him, at the king who had knelt in the mud for me, the monster who had become my sanctuary. I felt the golden bond swell in my chest, expanding until it filled every corner of my soul, pushing out the last lingering shadows of the girl who had been rejected in the rain. I smiled, and I felt the truth of it ring in the air between us. Absolute and unbreakable. "I'm not just happy, Magnus," I whispered, pulling him down until our lips were a breath apart. "I am home." And so, in the quiet of a winter storm, the Omega found her voice, and the king found his heart. Their story is a reminder that sometimes the rejection we fear the most is simply fate clearing the path for the love we truly deserve. Thank you for walking this path with Mira and Magnus, for enduring the rain to find the warmth of the fire. If their journey touched your soul, please take a moment to subscribe to Storm's Werewolf Romance Library. Your support helps us bring more of these fated connections to life. Until next time, keep your heart open to the moon. You never know who might be waiting in the woods.